As we continue our study of Unit 8 in Freshman World History, we have turned our attention to imperialism, the use of Western and European powers of conquest of smaller nations around the world, generally for economic gain. Today, we specifically want to look at how Europeans justified this often violent and detestable act. In order to do so, let's look at a primary source example of what a person of that time believed about imperialism. Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. It was a poem written in 1899 that was meant to describe why imperialism should be done. Rudyard Kipling was a British citizen who actually lived most of his life in India, and many of his works actually reflect that, including a famous book that many of you are probably familiar with, The Jungle Book. What follows in this video is a line-by-line analysis of Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. We look at specific excerpts from that poem to better understand imperialism. In order to do that, I recommend that you read the document first before following along in here. So if you need to do that, there's a link down below in the description that gives the full text of that poem. He opens the poem by saying this: "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' need." Already, it appears that Kipling takes on kind of a commanding tone, right? He's ordering people to do something. Now, specifically, he wants us to help with or take up the white man's burden. Now, typically a burden is something that is heavy. It's a responsibility that weighs on you. A lot of times we talk about burdens in regards to pack animals. That's what they carry when you put supplies or whatever needs to be carried on it. So this burden could be something heavy that he believes that, again, white people need to carry, or it could be something a little more figurative. It could be a job or responsibility. And whatever that job or responsibility is, it's going to require the best of the best. And it's pretty clear that Kipling already has a pretty clear indication of what he believes is the best. Again, it goes back to this idea of white people, or Europeans in this case. It is very important for us to take into account the point of view of our author. In this case, Rudyard Kipling is a European, and with that, he has a very European bias, and he definitely believes that the best of breed is the white individual. So it's safe for us to assume that Rudyard Kipling believes that white or European individuals are the best of the best. At least that's his point of view, and that's what he's writing from. But then Kipling does give us more of an indication of what this burden is. It involves serving your captives' need. While he hasn't told us who these captives are, it is clear that he thinks the burden is to go into exile or to leave home in order to serve these captives or help them out, right? They are in need and they need assistance, and it's the burden or responsibility of the European to serve that. But what exactly do the captives need help with? What exactly is the burden that needs to be carried? Well, that's where Kipling gives us some more indication. He says to wait in heavy harness. Now, this is probably a reference to something that horses typically did. In a team of horses, horses are tied together or harnessed by the wagon, and they are meant to do the heavy lifting, to pull the wagon or to pull the individuals. And in many cases, they are seen as the leader of that wagon. But Kipling speaks of the people that are going to need to be pulled or be led. And he says that they are fluttered folk and wild, basically meaning that these people are a little bit different, and that's why they need to be led in the right direction. He then calls these people new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. In using words like sullen and half devil, half child, or fluttered and wild, Kipling is painting the picture of individuals who are probably barbaric or backward or wild and different from the Europeans that he has painted so civilized. So already in the first section of this poem, we see a pretty dark perspective from Rudyard Kipling. He definitely has a pro-European bias and essentially is believing that anyone who is not civilized like Europeans are wild and barbaric or somewhat gloomy or even childish or devilish. Kipling wants the white man to take up the burden of leading the rest of the world and helping bring light or civilization to all these darkened areas. It's definitely a racially charged piece. Kipling clearly believes that there are people around the world who need the saving of the efforts of the European. In our next section, we see Kipling start the section the same way he did with the first, saying, take up the white man's burden. Again, he's trying to bring home this idea of white Europeans having this responsibility to aid the rest of the world. Kipling believes that white men are the best and the brightest and that they've been more successful than people around the world. So again, there's that responsibility here to bring civilization to the rest of the world. But here he also says it's going to take patience to wait for these people to catch up, that it's not going to be an instant gratification of bringing white culture or European culture to these other places. Kipling also believes that the white man is to veil the threat of terror or to begin to bring light into the darkness. And he also says that Europeans shouldn't be doing this out of pride. In fact, they should be checking the show of pride, meaning they should check their pride and they should make sure that they're doing this out of good nature, not to seem arrogant and better than everyone else. So here it seems like Kipling is encouraging everyone in Europe or in the Western world to make a sacrifice to bring their culture and their civilization to the rest of the world. But then Kipling's insensitivity to other people of the world comes back again. He says, by open speech and simple 100 times made plain. Here he's talking about speaking simply and plainly in a way that these other people could understand. Again, he's elevating the role of Europeans and the intellectual role of Europeans while degrading the rest of the world. He says here, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Again, Kipling believes that Europeans or white people are doing this to build up the rest of the world and bring them to a similar level that Europeans are at. If you're confused so far, that's okay, because Kipling has been fairly vague. He hasn't really said how Europeans can help or what exactly it is that they're supposed to do, but we'll find that in the next section. Later on in the poem, Kipling gives more description of what exactly he thinks Europeans should be doing in this case when they go and encounter native peoples of different places around the world. He says this, take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. Again, Kipling tries to show that white Europeans are better than those that they are conquering. And yet for this burden, this job of helping these people, their reward is only blame from the people they conquer and hatred from these people that they conquer. And yet Kipling, through all of this, says that it needs to be done because they are guarding or protecting these people. It's an interesting perspective from Kipling because, again, he shows that these people probably aren't going to be accepting of European involvement. They're not going to enjoy that. In fact, they're going to meet it with hate and blame. Yet through all of this, Kipling says that it's worth it because it is rewarding, but it's also, again, this responsibility. Then Kipling speaks of the cry of hosty humor, ah, slowly to the light. Here he indicates that these people are going to resist moving towards the light. Again, the light is probably a reference to the ways of European society, the civilized style. Here Kipling says that these people probably are going to resist this. In order to make this claim more clear and to make this burden more clear and a responsibility as to why to do that, Kipling uses a biblical reference. He says, why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? This is clearly a reference to the story of Exodus, to the Jewish people being released from their bondage in Egypt. So in this way, Kipling is connecting this white man's burden that he's created back to the biblical story of the Exodus of the Israelites. He connects it to a Christian morality. Kipling believes that bringing civilization to these different people of the world is in fact a reflection of greater Christian mission. Kipling believes that the old way of life that these native civilizations were enjoying was actually almost a form of bondage or slavery, that they were trapped in their old ways. And just like the Israelites getting out of Egypt was their freedom, the freedom of these native peoples is joining the new European style of culture. We skip ahead to the final stanza of Kipling's The White Man's Burden, and he says this, take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy, ungrudged praise. For what seems like the 1,000th time, Kipling encourages the readers to take up this burden once again, but he does so in a way that it tries to encourage these people to leave their old ways. Essentially, he says, grow up and quit living in the past and living in the days of children and receive what is your reward. That reward is clearly referenced here with the reference to a laurel and to praise. A laurel is a symbol of peace and oftentimes honor that was given out by the ancient Greeks. It's the same type of crown that Roman Caesars like Julius and Augustus would have worn with the leaves around the head. And finally, Kipling wraps up his poem by saying this, come now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-brought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Here again, he implores white individuals or European individuals to
search their manhood or become that which a man is supposed to be, and to do so quickly, to do it now. And once again, he outlines that this is a difficult, long task, but if Europeans engage imperialism, it will bring them wisdom and it will make them better than they were before. Kipling says kind of the final carrot, if you will, is that they will receive judgment of your peers. And based on the tone of this entire poem, it's pretty clear that judgment from peers means a good thing, that you will be lifted up amongst your peers and you will have attention and fame and all of that because of what was done in imperialism.
Having read The White Man's Burden, you now have an understanding of one justification that Europeans had for imperialism. Europeans clearly believed that they had a moral obligation, whether God-given or not, to bring light to the uncivilized cultures around the world. However, it wasn't just Kipling that believed this. Many Europeans at this time believed that this is why Europeans had the right to colonize different areas. They were bringing with them civilization. They were rescuing people from their darkness, as Kipling called it. Yet what these individuals failed to take into account is that maybe the people of these cultures liked the way they were living. Maybe they didn't necessarily want to be civilized like the rest of the world. Their ways and cultures had been established for thousands of years, and they were perfectly comfortable doing this. So this justification of bringing light to these different nations doesn't really hold up. It's not only culturally insensitive and wrong, it justifies a practice that for hundreds of years continues to go on and brings violence and turmoil to many places around the world. Yet this white man's burden, as Kipling calls it, is only one justification that Europeans would use for imperialism during the imperial era. And in our next video, we will continue to unpack other reasons as to why. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.